Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling some pretty intense discussions happening in the media, about the right wing, especially with all this talk of a possible new Trump era. And for you listening in, maybe wanting to get a handle on what's being said quickly and, well, thoroughly, we've done the digging into the key arguments, the perspectives behind them.
Exactly. Our mission here in this deep dive is really to unpack that, to go beyond the headlines, look at the core ideas, and understand the different angles. We're drawing mainly from a YouTube video transcript, which takes a pretty critical look at how the media is portraying the right these days.
Yeah, and just to give you a taste, the material we're looking at covers some, well, thought-provoking stuff. We'll be talking about Beatrice de Graaf, the AfD in Germany, their growing influence, and the trad wife thing that's been popping up. Okay, let's dive in, starting with a statement that definitely makes you pause.
Yes, a really key point in our source is this discussion around Beatrice de Graaf. She was on a show, Butenhof, and the general theme was this idea of the liberal rules-based order being, under threat from conservative movements.
Right. And in that conversation, de Graaf mentioned something pretty stark. Empathy is a sin. Now, on the surface, that sounds, well, extreme. But the source we looked at digs into where that actually comes from and what it might mean now.
Yeah, it's interesting because it wasn't actually her statement originally. The source traces it back to a tweet by a pastor, Ben Garrett. He was criticizing Donald Trump for not showing what Garrett called unbridled, unlimited empathy towards certain minority groups. This was specifically in a church setting, apparently with LGBTQ plus symbols present.
Okay, right. And the argument then, according to our source material, is that Garrett saw Trump's refusal as a kind of tactic, like disarming the left's weapon of empathy. The idea being, if the right doesn't play the game, doesn't perform constant empathy on the left's terms, maybe they can't be controlled or attacked as easily that way. It's framed as strategic.
Which ties into another idea, attributed this time to Joe Rickney, suggesting the left uses empathy politically, almost playing on people's fear of being seen as uncaring to, well, shut down criticism, kind of sets the rules of engagement, you could say.
So if you don't show empathy exactly how they expect, you're immediately, what, insensitive, uncaring. And the source also brings up a counter-argument that this specific kind of empathy, the left-wing version they're describing, can feel a bit condescending, as if it assumes certain groups can't manage on their own.
Precisely. And the source makes a distinction here, based on Rickney and Garrett's thinking, between empathy and compassion. Compassion, in their view, is about helping someone genuinely in need, but also, making sure you're okay too, looking after yourself. They contrast this with what they see as the less demand for this boundless empathy, which they argue could lead to everyone sort of drowning together because you lose the ability to make necessary distinctions.
So the argument goes, too much empathy, or the wrong kind, clouds your judgment, makes it hard to draw lines. And it could even mean feeling empathy for people or ideas that are seen as, well, harmful. That seems to be a major point of contention they're raising.
Yeah, and stepping back, the source suggests this perspective feeds into a larger feeling that the current liberal order operates on a kind of fake faith. The argument being that traditional values, maybe objective truths, are being pushed aside for feelings. Emotional responses become the top priority. It's a critique of emphasis, really.
And there's more. The source mentions this view that the left tends to dehumanize the right, accusing them of just lacking emotion, lacking empathy altogether. They even cite an example from The Guardian, apparently showing right-leaning people sort of casually picnicking while ignoring suffering nearby, a very strong image.
Right. And the analysis then asks why this perceived weaponization of empathy is seen as harmful. The source argues, first, it doesn't actually help people long-term. Second, it manipulates genuinely empathetic people. And third, it creates what they term a victim pyramid.
A victim pyramid. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It's this idea that certain groups are always at the top, always deserving of empathy, while others, maybe white people, Christians, those labeled privileged, are just expected to give empathy constantly without their own concerns getting much airtime. It creates a kind of hierarchy for who deserves emotional attention.
And to make that point clearer, the source mentions this example about progressive Americans allegedly being upset about white South African refugees coming to the U.S. The argument being made is that this shows maybe an inconsistency in who gets empathy based on whether it fits a certain narrative.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit, because the source also talks about something interesting, a perceived lack of irony in how some media figures discuss the right.
Yes, this was quite an observation. The source notes how figures like, again, Beatrice de Graaf and also Jitske Kramer often present these right-wing ideas like empathy is a sin, quite straightforwardly, almost without irony, as if accepting them as just, well, what the right genuinely believes, full stop. Right. And the suggestion is maybe this shows a kind of flat thinking, an inability to see double standards, or how criticisms might boomerang back onto their own side. Like they're so sure of their own position, they can't see the nuances or contradictions elsewhere.
Exactly. The source uses Jitsky Kramer saying the right doesn't want democracy anymore as an example. But the counterargument presented is that, well, maybe right-wing voters see voting as their way to fight back against what they perceive as liberal dogma. So from their perspective, they are using democracy just to challenge the way things are. It shows how differently actions can be read.
Yeah, it's like the media picture of the right becomes this really simple, almost like a kid's drawing, lacks depth, lacks critical analysis, maybe. Makes you wonder how much real understanding is happening in these media talks.
It definitely raises questions about how groups see and portray each other. Okay, moving on. This deep dive also took us into Germany, looking at the AfD, the alternative for Germany.
Right, the AfD. They've recently been officially classified as right-wing extremist by German intelligence. Now, our source offers a specific take on this, suggesting it might be, well, more political than factual.
The argument put forward is that this label is basically a political tool used by the ruling parties because the AfD is getting quite popular, around 27% support, reportedly. And the source suggests these established parties might not have strong arguments or, legitimate political ways to counter that rise.
That's a pretty bold claim. It implies that rather than engaging with the reasons why people support the AfD, the system is opting to label and maybe sideline them. The source even hints that the system might feel unable to reverse things like immigration or climate policies, so it attacks its own people, AfD voters, instead.
hmm And this ties into a call mentioned by Jell von Bardenberg in the source for a civilizational discussion in Germany. Basically, a need to talk about what it actually means to be German, beyond just having the passport. The worry is that just focusing on citizenship strips away the deeper cultural, historical sense of identity.
And the AfD's view, as presented in the source, is exactly that. Defining German just by a passport ignores that shared culture, that history, that sense of belonging people feel is vital.
Yeah, they see it as dismissing a core part of national identity. So the source really emphasizes the view that calling that perspective the one focused on cultural identity, right-wing extremist, is pretty shocking and needs pushback. It's framed as a fundamental clash over defining nationhood.
Okay, and finally, let's look at this trad wife phenomenon.
Yes, this is something Fedon Eckes observed online. Women choosing very openly to be stay-at-home wives, focusing on kids, family, that traditional role.
Right. And Eckes in the source raises some concerns. She worries about a possible link to right-wing extremism, sometimes seeing hashtags associated with these videos, things like nativism, anti-Semitism, white nationalism.
Eckes also expresses discomfort with trad wives who might say oppose contraception or abortion or seem to embrace a more subservient role. She sees potential issues there for women's autonomy.
But then the source brings in the other side. The argument that these women are just making a free choice. And it even suggests this choice might be a reaction against feeling like they can't express different views, maybe more traditional views, in the workplace or society today. It flips the script on freedom.
Exactly. And this highlights a potential tension, according to the source, that criticism from some left-leaning women might show a lack of tolerance for choices that don't fit the standard feminist narrative. It connects back to that broader theme. The source keeps hitting the alleged tendency on the left to discredit anything that seems even slightly connected to the right.
So we're seeing a real clash here between ideas of individual choice and these larger ideological frameworks and how different sides judge those choices.
Absolutely. I mean, this deep dive into the source material shows it's a really complex, often quite heated landscape in these media discussions about the right. We've touched on empathy as a concept, potential media bias, the political situation in Germany with the AfD, and these different takes on the trad wife trend.
Yeah, and as you can probably tell, the source material gives us a lot to chew on, highlighting just how varied and often contradictory the viewpoints are.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. What is the real function of empathy and maybe irony, too, in our political debates today? How do different groups define them, use them, and perhaps most importantly, what might be the underlying reasons why different ideologies get portrayed the way they do in the media?
Definitely something worth thinking about.